Hello, and welcome back to the third and final lecture on the history of Japan, or at least a very swift overview of said history. This is lecture number 3, Japan and the Rest of the World. So when last we left, we were in the Edo period under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. This was a period of prosperity and cultural flourishing for the Japanese nation. However, it was also a period of great isolation and social control. In particular, contact with the outside world was very proscribed, and Japan really was developing, or in some cases encountering, challenges to the old system, such as a tension between the cultural vanguard and the more socially conservative government elites, and also a system that was really set up to reward place in the class hierarchy over meritocracy and competence in actual governing. So between that and the isolation, Japan was in some ways very vulnerable when the outside world in fact showed up on Japan's doorstep in the form of a United States naval fleet commanded by Commodore Perry in 1853, often called the Black Fleet. They sail into Tokyo, actually I think technically it was Yokohama Harbor, and force the Japanese essentially at gunpoint to open trade relations with the West. Technological, in particular military technology, development in the West had when Japan was isolated and unable to really benefit from that knowledge accelerated a great deal. And it was very clear to the Japanese that the United States and Western powers had the military means to force whatever agreements they wished. And those agreements that they forced were quite detrimental from a Japanese point of view. They're referred to in Japanese as the unequal treaties, and they basically allowed the United States and soon after England, France, Russia to exploit Japan economically, to have very favorable kinds of trade deals, and perhaps most insultingly of all, a sort of carte blanche diplomatic immunity for Westerners who are now moving to Japan to do business. And this principle of what they called extraterritoriality held that if any crime was committed by a non-Japanese person, they could not be tried in a Japanese court. They could only be tried in Western-style courts, which unsurprisingly were biased pretty heavily in favor of said Westerners. So as you can imagine, these treaties were deeply unpopular with the Japanese people. It was a real blow to their sense of pride and autonomy, and in fact, anger about the perceived betrayal by their government inspired several rebellions against the shogunate and the Bakufu for having agreed to such terms. And to make a long and complex story short, eventually the rebels won out. They overthrew the Tokugawa family in a period we call the Meiji Restoration. We call it that because the emperor, whose name/title was Meiji, was officially put in power. Now remember, the emperor had been essentially a figurehead for the last millennium. And the official outcome of these rebellions was the emperor was now restored to political power. In practice, the emperor still was largely a figurehead. There was just an oligarchy of new leadership. And this leadership took a very interesting approach, that they decided they needed to become more like the West in terms of learning its ways of power. And so they reorganized Japan as a constitutional republic in Western style, at least of sorts. And they begin actively inviting, recruiting, highly paying Western consultants to help them update and change their styles of agriculture, technology, heavy industry, finance, politics, all along Western lines, while still supervising that process to make sure that they did not lose what they felt was their distinctive Japanese culture. So in some ways, this was a time of immense change and transformation. In another way, this was seen as sort of taking the bull by the horns when it comes to cultural change not waiting for it to be forced upon them the way that Western culture was forced upon, let's say, India, or to a lesser extent, China, during periods of imperialism and colonialism. This was sort of a self-transformation with the intent of Japan becoming a power recognized by the West as a peer. And part of how they sought to do that was by copying the way in which the West became so economically powerful, and that was by finding weaker nations that they could exploit. And so the Japanese government set about building their own colonial empire. This was not the first time that Japanese forces invaded China and Korea, but it was a modern mechanized way of doing so with some of the same ethos that we saw in Western colonialism. And so you see this imperialist phase begin in Japan. Part of it involves dueling with the Russians and actually achieving some significant military victories. They win the Russo-Japanese War, and that sort of is seen as a sign that Japan is a power to be respected as opposed to just colonized. They take part, albeit in a very small way, in World War I, and then that allows the Japanese to claim a number of islands that had been previously German colonies. They invade the Philippines, and they start to settle their own citizens in these lands, and again, a style of settlement and colonization that in many ways mirrors that of the West. And for Japanese folks who are not from aristocratic or samurai backgrounds, even though the samurai as a class were sort of officially dissolved, there's still an aristocracy, there's still an oligarchy. And this system of colonization was popular among many average Japanese because it represented to them a chance to reinvent themselves in a new frontier, or at the very least benefit from the economic spoils of colonialism. And of course, an ideology went hand in hand with Japanese imperialism that was sort of a veneer over this grab for power and cheap labor and cheap goods. And much like you saw concepts in the West like the white man's burden and this move to civilize the so-called lesser peoples of the world, you saw the same kind of rhetoric in Japan. The phrase translates to Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And the idea behind that was that really this was all about raising the standard of living for people in Korea and China and the Philippines and what would become Micronesia. And in the process, the native peoples were forced to learn Japanese, to take Japanese names, and of course to obey the Japanese occupational governments, and were really never treated as anything close to equal citizens of the growing Japanese empire. However, if there was irony here, it certainly was not consciously felt when the Japanese government's propaganda engine sort of portrayed Japanese imperialism as a more beneficial alternative than Western imperialism. And one of the things that you need in order to pursue imperial ambitions is a very strong and well-resourced military. And so the military becomes increasingly in charge of resources in Japan, and thus increasingly powerful when it comes to having a voice in the government. And you start to reach a point in the 1920s when the military is operating pretty much independently of civilian oversight. At first, it's in the background and sort of, people agree not to notice, but soon enough, civilian rulers start to get displaced and even assassinated. And the military, by the 1930s, has essentially turned Japan into a dictatorship. As with Western colonialism, Japanese colonialism could be extremely brutal. There were a number of atrocities enacted by Japanese soldiers against civilians as well as soldiers in their imperial conquests. Perhaps the most famous or infamous is the rape of Nanking, or the Nanking Massacre, where something on the order of 300,000 Chinese civilians, mostly women and children, were tortured and mass executed by Japanese soldiers. There was also the phenomenon of the comfort women, who were women that were from Korea, who were forcibly impressed into service to serve as sexual companions for Japanese soldiers during the occupation. A lot of very bad things. The Western nations during this time condemns these. Japan drew a lot of condemnation from Western nations. You could call that hypocritical if you want during these times. All except from Germany, which had, by the late 1930s, early 1940s, begun fighting other Western nations. And so they were looking for allies, and the Japanese government was looking for Western nations that would let them keep their colonial conquests and not hassle them about that. And so you get this sort of alliance of convenience between the Nazi regime in Germany and the Japanese military government. It is certainly not like either side really respected or thought well of the other, but this was an alliance of convenience. And the Allied Western powers responded by boycotting all oil trade with Japan, setting up blockades, in fact, to interfere with Japanese shipping. And that was a extraordinarily effective tactic against Japan at the time, because Japan is very natural resource poor, really depends a lot on this shipping to keep its economy going, and particularly to fuel its war machine. And so the Japanese leadership is sort of facing a hard decision here. They can accept this boycott and really lose their power to continue to wage the kind of wars they feel they need to wage to maintain their colonial holdings, or they can choose to attack, in this case, the United States, which was participating eagerly, actively in the boycott, in the hopes that the United States will back off. They choose the US both for proximity and also since the United States is not a belligerent at this time in World War II. They're not going to draw down the ire of England or other allied nations. And the commanders knew quite well that if they attacked the USA and the USA really responded in force, they wouldn't be able to win a prolonged military conflict. And so the decision they come to is they'll attack a US colony. Hawaii at the time was not part of the United States proper. It was a place that the United States had forcibly colonized for economic and military reasons. And it had the added benefit of having Pearl Harbor, which was host to the lion's share of the US Pacific Fleet. So this would be sort of a message they wanted to send to the United States to back off, and also to cripple the United States Pacific naval defenses in the process. As we know, this risk does not pay off. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor actually failed to destroy most of the Pacific Fleet. There's some question about whether the United States government secretly had advance warning or not, whether this was just the excuse that President Roosevelt was looking for to enter the United States into the Second World War. But regardless, the United States does enter into the Second World War by declaring war on Japan and therefore bringing a German declaration of war against the US. And this kicks off not just the United States participation in the European theater, but of course the Pacific theater of World War II as well, which was far bloodier than the European part of World War II, if that can be imagined. Somewhere around 4.5 million soldiers and as many as 11 million civilians perished over the next 5 years. And many consider those numbers to be grossly underinflated. I'm going with the conservative numbers. Japan really is not able to, as they knew from the beginning, adequately repel the United States. In fact, their hopes of having giant fleet engagements in which to wear down the US Pacific Fleet really doesn't work out. The US doesn't take the bait, and there's a series of island hopping engagements. And really, by the time we crawl towards the end of the Pacific War, Japan has really lost most of its ability to fight in either naval or certainly aerial theaters. And the United States forces are at the front door, so to speak, of the Japanese main islands. The emperor and the military have a choice here. They can choose to surrender or to keep on fighting. They vow to keep on fighting, to turn this into a real slog for United States soldiers. And so the US responds by dropping the first 2 atomic weapons in the history of warfare on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, death counts are debated. Somewhere around 200,000 people, mostly civilians, die in these blasts. And this is on top of fire bombings that had been taking place where the US Air Force was dropping incendiary devices on Japanese homes throughout the country, where as many as 100,000 Japanese a day were being killed. So, you know, this really kind of leaves Japan with little choice in the Japanese surrender. In fact, it's the first time the emperor ever addresses the majority of his subjects. It's a radio address. In Japanese history prior, only very, very highly ranked people ever had a chance to hear the emperor speak. And under the terms of the surrender, Japan becomes ruled by US military occupation. The country is remade into a Western-style democracy, is banned from having an offensive army. That still remains a part of the Japanese constitution today, although there are certainly movements among certain elements of Japanese political society to try and change that, but for the moment that's still in place. And Japan's reconstruction proceeds rapidly. The United States invests a great deal of money in rebuilding Japan, and some of that is because they want Japan to be a bulwark against the growing power of the Soviet Union. As the US occupation ends, the country looks on track toward becoming a liberal democracy, and I mean that in both senses of liberal in the idea of the political state, and liberal also in terms of left-leaning politics. But the United States really takes an active hand in keeping Japan from getting too liberal because there is an influential movement among the Japanese political left to try and turn Japan into a more socialized, perhaps even a communist society. And so the United States winds up pouring a lot of support and funding into Japan's conservative right wing. In fact, this means sometimes pardoning or just seeking not to prosecute many former war criminals who promised to keep the left under control. Post-war Japanese Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke was probably the most controversial of these figures, who certainly had a record that would have led him to be indicted as a war criminal, but the United States supported him because he vowed to be anti-communist. There was a period when the Japanese left really staged many protests and bids for government. Those bids were crushed both politically and also sometimes violently. Not only the Japanese police, but paramilitary groups, some of whom were tied with Japan's organized crime, the Yakuza, really were able to crush the Japanese left. And by the 1970s, the left really was not a significant force in Japanese politics anymore. So today, Japan presents a fusion of traditional Japanese and Western culture. It's an economic superpower in the global community. It's the world's 4th largest economy. It pursues a lot of innovative research and technology and business practices, which in turn have gone on to inform and teach large parts of the Western world. During the wars in the 2000s, with the American invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, at least in the initial years, there were those who felt that those wars could produce a similar effect to the occupation and transformation of Japan. History has shown that did not happen. There are many potential reasons why that did not happen. One might be the ethnic homogeneity of the Japanese people. Iraq, and to a lesser extent Afghanistan, are conglomerates of a great many ethnic groups and religious sects, some of whom were forced to co-occupy a nation state because of the way that Western colonizing powers drew boundaries. And so they had only sort of been unified polities because of the heavy hand of dictators, and the systems that the US put in place to try and govern without those dictators' brutal hands really were not able to keep them together. Another theory is that, well, the unconditional surrender of Japan wasn't entirely unconditional. There were some concessions, including keeping the emperor alive, not conducting any attacks on certain historical sites and holy sites. To this day, Kyoto is the only major city in Japan that still has centuries-old architecture because it was the one city that wasn't bombed to the ground during the war. US and Allied forces were not always as careful in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of destroying holy sites, and that in turn engendered great resentment among the people. I happen to credit active efforts to sustain friendship between US and Japanese civilians. There were exchanges. I'm particularly fond of an exchange of friendship dolls conducted by educator Dr. Sidney Gulick that in a pre-internet age allowed Japanese and American children to see each other as human beings through the exchanges of dolls and letters. There were a number of Japanese-American friendship societies that were formed that to this day still promote exchange and communication and scholarships for foreign study. I think that was an opportunity that we were not able to take as much advantage of during the 2000s because of post-9/11 restrictions on foreign student study. There was also a substantial anti-war movement in Japan following the conclusion of the Pacific War. And I think one of the few vestiges of the Japanese left that has remained is the anti-nuclear movement and pro-environmental movements in the country. Today, Japan's government has been run pretty much continually since 1955 by a single party, the LDP, or Liberal Democratic Party, which confusingly for those of us in the United States, this is not a liberal party or a democratic party in the sense of the US Democratic Party. It's a socially and financially conservative party. But just to make things even more complicated, they do support a strong social safety net. So Japan's economic growth really soared from the 1960s to the 1990s. Some of that was because of some fixed dollar to yen arrangements and heavy investment in the public sector. But in the 1990s, a sort of real estate bubble burst, and Japan has never fully recovered economically. And there are those who say, well, Japan's economic approach really needs to be less regulated than it is. They need to sacrifice some of their social and economic safety nets when it comes to healthcare or lifetime employment, that would really allow it to have the kind of GDP growth that we see in the US. And of course, the counter-argument in Japan is that would also produce the kind of vast income inequality that we see in the United States. So Japan remains in sort of an economic stagnation, but that's a choice in many ways in order to preserve certain commitments to their social safety nets and supports. Obviously, the Japanese people are not of one mind about this issue, and this is something that is continually debated. It just doesn't seem to result in a change to the governing party. Another challenge Japan faces today is an increasingly aging population. It's well below replacement rate. People live long lives and have few children, but there is still very large opposition to immigration that could potentially replace the young workforce. There's really a conservatism that pervades the Japanese government and much of Japanese society when it comes to keeping that ethnic homogeneity. So that's a big challenge Japan is facing. Also from a Western point of view in terms of gender equality or LGBTQ rights, racial equality, Japan really is not nearly as liberal a place as Western Europe or even the United States. That said, Japan has taken a leading role in global environmentalism. The Kyoto Protocols, which were an attempt to limit greenhouse gases across the world, sort of a forerunner to the Paris Accords, were a Japanese genesis. There's something called Cool Biz, which is a sort of approach to formal business attire that sort of gives you cultural permission to dress a little less formally at work if it means you don't need to turn on the air conditioning as much. There is a robust and widespread recycling program in Japan. There's a lot of carbon neutral energy being produced, although the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster unfortunately set Japan back in that regard. Japan has turned more to fossil fuel production than it had been previously because of a desire to avoid overdependence on nuclear power in the wake of that disaster. Of course, Japan also exerts a vast cultural influence worldwide throughout much of not just the Western, but the non-Western worlds because of Japanese anime and video games. And this is sort of a cultural touchstone that resonates with youth all over the world. So that brings us pretty much to the present day. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe, and if you like these videos, let me know, and I will make some more. どうもありがとうございました。